She was Europe's most scandalous princess. Her wildness went far beyond anything you could ever imagine. She turned her bedroom into a political salon and transformed the pleasures of the bed into a symbol of power. She even indulged in nightly revelries with her own brother, unrestrained in her passions, yet deeply devoted in love. She had countless noble lovers, yet often kissed the severed head of the man she truly adored. She penned Europe's very first female autobiographical memoir. On the parchment, it wasn't just tales of her amorous adventures, it was a record of the intricate conspiracies behind Europe's brutal religious wars. When she wrote the famous line, "My body is mine to command," the aging lawmakers of the Paris Parliament were horrified, realizing that this woman was crafting a new history, one that lived outside the pages of official legal archives. Beneath her veiled words, it was clear, in a world ruled by men, this was a woman's dazzling rebellion against her destined chains. Let's step into the French film Queen Margot. In the latter half of the 16th century, France was engulfed in relentless wars between Catholics and Protestants. The court was lavish, but the nobility was rotten to the core. To stop the civil war and secure a crumbling throne, Catherine de' Medici, the Catholic Queen Mother, arranged for her daughter, Princess Margot, to marry King Henri of Navarre, a Protestant. Margot did not love Henri. She was nothing more than a political sacrifice for her mother's grand strategy. On August 18, 1572, a grand and extraordinary wedding took place at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Protestant leaders from all corners of France gathered for this wedding of the century, each with their own hidden agendas. The marriage between 29-year-old Margot and 19-year-old Henri was a gamble, a bet for peace under her brother Charles IX's reign, and the future of the French crown. The cardinal solemnly asked Margot if she would take Henri as her husband. Wearing a pearl-encrusted gown, Margot's face was icy cold, her pale chin lifted with pride, and her piercing blue eyes betrayed not a flicker of warmth. She had resisted this political marriage from the start. At the time, she was in love with the Duke of Guise, but her mother tore them apart. Silence hung in the air like a shroud. The cardinal looked to her again, waiting. Still, she refused to respond. Whispers broke out among the guests. Her brothers and mother seated behind her shifted awkwardly. When the cardinal asked a third time, her brother, King Charles IX, finally lost his temper. On the surface, her brothers welcomed Henri, but behind their smiles, they mocked him, knowing Margot's heart belonged elsewhere. Catherine claimed the marriage was to ease religious tensions. In reality, she aimed to bring this new Protestant power under her control. As Protestants rose to greet the couple, both Margot and Henri knew this union had nothing to do with love. Margot didn't even glance at her new husband. They agreed, on their wedding night, they would not disturb each other. Catherine placed Lady Charlotte by Henry's side, tasked with seducing him. Henri could feel the hostility around him. He realized that Margot, though appearing cold and confident, was just as scared as he was. Behind them, Margot's brothers whispered about who had been in her room the night before, and who would be there tonight. The farce of a wedding finally ended. Margot turned to Henri and said coldly, "Don't come to my room tonight." The wedding celebrations would last for 3 days: banquets, masked balls, and parades. But tension was already boiling in the streets. The hostility between Catholics and Protestants was about to explode. In a sea of unfamiliar faces, Margot searched for a partner for her wedding night, but the list her friend gave her didn't include anyone she liked. Her brothers began to fight among themselves, each wanting to be the one to claim her. Eventually, her lover, the Duke of Guise, won the scuffle. Margot whispered, "See you tonight." Meanwhile, Lady Charlotte seductively approached Henri. Though wary, Henri could not refuse the advances of such a beautiful woman. Guise, full of jealousy, picked a fight with Henri, but to everyone's surprise, the shorter, slighter Henri held his own. The fight was broken up quickly. That night, Guise arrived early to Margot's chambers. She comforted him, saying that although she couldn't remember which brother had taken her virginity, tonight, her wedding night, she would give herself to him. Suddenly, Margot's friend warned, "Your husband is coming." In panic, Margot hid Guise. Henri wasn't looking for affection. He was seeking an ally in a hostile court. He told Margot, "To your mother and brothers, you are nothing but a bargaining chip. They would trade you to anyone, as long as it secured peace." Henri begged her for protection. He was a stranger in this land, surrounded by unknown dangers. He knew this marriage was a trap, and Margot was the bait. Margot urged him to be quiet. Her anxious eyes darted around, and Henri realized someone was listening. The three stood there in uneasy silence, though this was a marriage in name only. In that moment, the desperate Henri clung to Margot as his only lifeline. Seeing her bedroom meant for their wedding night was already occupied, Henri left in heartbreak. Guys, too, lost his desire. Margo explained, I may not love him, but I will not harm him. Watching him leave, Margo was torn and confused. That evening, Margo and her friend donned masks and wandered through the streets of Paris. Suddenly, a young man was robbed of his horse and money. In the chaos, he dropped a book. Margo returned it to him. His handsome, vulnerable demeanor awakened her protective instincts, and Margot's noble, mysterious aura captivated him. They found a hidden corner and gave into the moment. What began as a fleeting attraction turned into something deeper. In the touch of a hand, their fates became entwined. By dawn, Margo and her friend had vanished into the morning mist. The man took his only possession, a hunting book, to the local pawnshop in exchange for a few coins. The shopkeeper, intrigued by the book, offered him 100 silver pieces. During their conversation, the man mentioned he was looking for a friend nearby, but the shopkeeper delivered devastating news. The man he sought had just been gunned down. Only minutes ago, a group of Protestant followers surrounded the bleeding man. Fortunately, the bullet had only grazed his arm, but this entire incident was no accident. It was orchestrated by Catherine. Margo knew all too well her mother and brother had once arranged the death of Henri's mother. Now, they were targeting the Protestants. And next on the list was Henri. She begged Henri to flee France immediately, but he asked her a question that pierced her heart. Will you come with me? Vengeance was brewing on the Protestant side. Henri, as their king, was accompanied by many loyal attendants. The Huguenots had also come to Paris for the wedding. But now, danger loomed over them like a storm cloud. Catherine decided to escalate the tension. On August 24th, 1572 ST, Bartholomew's Day, Catholic nobles and citizens launched a ruthless massacre under the pretense of purging heresy. Guys led a violent mob and ambushed the Huguenot nobles attending the wedding. The streets were ablaze with fire and soaked in blood. Tens of thousands of Catholics, alongside police and soldiers, carried out the mass slaughter. They had already marked the homes of the Huguenots with white crosses. Under the cover of darkness, they stormed inside, murdering sleeping families, then hurled the bodies into the River Seine. Fueled by religious fanaticism and bloodlust, they lost all sense of humanity. That night alone, more than 2,000 unarmed Protestants were killed. Thus began what history now remembers as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. The killing didn't stop with the sunrise. It dragged on into October, claiming over 70,000 lives. On the very day the massacre began, Henri and his men were captured by Guise. Margot witnessed firsthand the depths of her mother's cruelty. The Louvre had become a living hell. Nearly all the Protestant nobles who stood by Henri had been slaughtered. The marble floors ran red with blood. A man frantically knocked on every door, desperately seeking shelter. Finally, one door opened. He fell into Margot's arms. She drove the soldiers away and saved him. As she tended to his wounds, she realized this was the same handsome man she had met on her wedding night. His name was La Mole. His body was covered in injuries. The pain had left him delirious. Just then, Lady Charlotte burst in with terrible news. Henri had been taken by the king. Margot rushed to her mother and pleaded, "You cannot kill my husband." King Charles IX tried to force Henri to abandon his faith. Henri refused, even if it meant death. But Margot pleaded with him, "If you want to survive, you must accept." Eventually, Henri gave in. When Margot returned to her chambers, La Mole was gone. She searched through the piles of corpses, frantically turning them over one by one. On their wedding night, La Mole had saved her. Now, on this night of slaughter, she had saved him. Twice fate had brought them together. Margot believed it was divine intervention. But now, where could La Mole be? La Mole had survived. He trusted no one. Fleeing the palace, he collapsed among the dead. A headsman found him barely breathing. Moved by compassion, the executioner took him in. Meanwhile, Henri, under the watch of nobles and clergy, was forced to publicly renounce his Protestant beliefs and join the Catholic faith. Margot could no longer ignore the cruelty of her mother and brother. Though born a Catholic herself, she could not justify the horrifying violence she had witnessed. Now, she faced suspicion from her own husband, and the unbearable weight of betrayal by her family. Her brothers felt no shame. In fact, they took pride in the slaughter. Margot's fury exploded. She could no longer stay silent. Even Queen Catherine could not silence her daughter's thunderous accusations. Margot turned to Guise, her former lover, and cried out, "You're nothing but an executioner." His hands, once tender with her, were now stained with blood, and with them, he had destroyed every trace of love she once felt. This moment marked a turning point. Margot was no longer the naive princess. She had become a tragic symbol of political sacrifice. The massacre would haunt her for the rest of her life. Because of it, she was placed under house arrest by Catherine, forbidden to leave the Louvre. Catherine claimed it was for the sake of peace. Through the headsman, La Mole discovered the truth. Margot was actually a French princess, though her bloodline was tied to the ones who ordered the massacre. She had risked everything to save him. Now, all he wanted was to see her again, but the executioner warned him to let go of that hope. Both Margot and Henri were now prisoners in the palace. Every move watched, every word overheard, but La Mole swore he would free her. He returned to his homeland in search of reinforcements. Catherine's children were frail and politically weak. The dynasty stood on shaky ground, facing a succession crisis. Though Margot had publicly renounced her right to the throne, her husband Henri still had a claim, and if Margot's siblings were to die, Henri could inherit the French crown. Catherine, once confident of her power, was shaken. A mystic warned her, "All your children will perish. The future king of France will be Henri." Catherine made up her mind she had to eliminate Henri. No loose ends. She ordered her mystic to give Lady Charlotte a special lipstick. Charlotte, who had unknowingly fallen in love with Henri, was eager to see him again, but Catherine didn't want Margot interfering anymore. She planned to marry her off to the King of Spain. Spain's king had once shown interest in Margot, but Margot refused. "I'm already married." Catherine only smiled and said cryptically, "After tonight, you'll be free again." A terrible premonition overwhelmed Margot. She rushed to find Henri, only to see Charlotte applying the lipstick. Just as Henri leaned in to kiss her, Margot shoved him away. Charlotte began foaming at the mouth and collapsed in agony. Moments later, she took her final breath. Suddenly, the sound of urgent footsteps echoed in the corridor. The two quickly hid in the shadows. It was Margot's brothers, arriving to retrieve Henri's body, but all they found was Charlotte's corpse lying alone. They took the poisoned lipstick from the table, then they tossed Charlotte's body out the window to stage her death as a suicide. After they left, Henri was overwhelmed by fear and helplessness. He hated himself for being too weak to protect the woman who loved him. Margot gently consoled him, telling him not to give up. She warned him never to reveal who he loved, or someone else would be the next victim. That night, they consummated their marriage, but there was no love between them, only a moment of shared vulnerability. One was a puppet controlled by his mother and brothers, the other, a pawn surrounded by danger, his life hanging by a thread. La Mole couldn't forget Margot, so he returned to France. Through a friend, he found Margot's confidant, and learned that Margot missed him just as much. Every moment of every day, with help from the Duchess, the two finally reunited, without masks to hide behind. Their eyes were full of affection. They poured out their feelings for each other. La Mole became both Margot's lover and Henri's trusted courtier. All La Mole wanted was to rescue Margot and Henri. They had fallen for each other on Margot's wedding night. One was a French princess, the other merely a low-ranking noble. Their love transcended class and status. In a world of schemes and hatred, their love became something rare and precious. Some tried to persuade La Mole to give up. With Catherine's constant surveillance, even birds couldn't escape the Louvre, but La Mole was determined to get them out of France. Their one chance came during the royal hunting festival. King Charles IX, a hunting enthusiast, led the nobles deep into the forest. The hounds chased the wild boar into a trap. At the final moment, Charles hurled a spear toward the animal. The boar panicked and ran, spooking the king's horse. With a loud neigh, the horse threw Charles violently to the ground. The boar charged at him in a frenzy, but his brothers stood by and did nothing to help. Charles shouted for someone to shoot. In the chaos, the guards accidentally shot the horse instead. Henri stepped forward alone, facing the wild boar head-on. After a tense struggle, he finally saved the king, but his act of bravery only deepened his brother's resentment. In the face of absolute power, blood ties meant nothing against the instinct to survive. Margot escaped the Louvre through a secret passage, but she waited only for La Mole. La Mole told her Henri refused to flee. He had just saved the king's life, and now the king trusted him completely. Margot's tears streamed down her face. She wept like a child, soft, hesitant, and full of sorrow. Though she didn't love Henri, she still feared for his safety. To her, as long as he remained under his mother's control, his life would never truly be safe. Outside a crumbling castle, Margot begged La Mole never to leave her. To protect Henri, Margot had no choice but to return to the Louvre. But Henri did not appreciate her sacrifice. He had already heard whispers of Margot's affair with La Mole. Margot reminded him not to forget. It was the king who had ordered the slaughter of countless Protestants, but Henri believed Charles now trusted him, and he thought her fears were unnecessary. Still, the uncertainty was tearing Margot apart. All she wanted was to escape with him, and never look back. Just as Henri predicted, he became the king's closest confidant. They often hunted and spoke together in private, but Catherine was not finished with him. She ordered her youngest son to place a poisoned hunting book in Henri's chambers. The boy waited until the room was empty, then set the book on Henri's table. Suddenly, he heard footsteps approaching and hid in the shadows, but it was Henri's voice, coming from outside the window. The boy realized his terrible mistake. He saw the king happily flipping through the pages of the poisoned book. He knew his brother had fallen into their mother's trap, but he didn't dare say a word. All he could do was silently watch as Henri drew closer and closer to death. Margot's brothers, enraged by her affair with La Mole, burst into her room. They shoved her back and forth, hurling insults. Suddenly, the king collapsed from the effects of the poison. His body twisted in agony. His throat and stomach burned as if they were on fire. Then, as if by a miracle, he stood up and stumbled back to his chambers. There, he found his dog foaming at the mouth, its jaws clenched around a chewed-up piece of the hunting book. Henri rushed to the royal mystic, demanding answers. He was told the book had been laced with a slow-acting arsenic compound. Every symptom the mystic described matched exactly what Henri had felt. The king realized it was the mystic who had poisoned the lipstick, and now had soaked the hunting book in venom too. After relentless questioning, the truth came out. It was all the doing of his own mother, Catherine. But how could the King of France accuse his own mother of murder? For the honor of the royal family, he chose to die with the secret. But he knew, once he was gone, Catherine would never spare Henri. So during a hunting trip, he helped Henri escape. Henri begged him to also grant Margot her freedom. But in the end, Charles did not agree. The news of Charles IX's poisoning spread throughout France. To cover up the plot, Catherine needed a scapegoat, and the owner of the hunting book was La Mole. It was the same book he once pawned, complete with his handwritten signature. That book was now set to become La Mole's death sentence. Henri returned to his homeland and was welcomed by the people, but La Mole, tormented by worry for Margot's safety, grew frantic. With Henri's help, he secretly re-entered Paris, determined to rescue Margot, but he and his companion walked straight into Guy's trap. When Margot arrived and begged Guy to let La Mole go, Guy, long estranged from her, refused and took them both away. The king's health deteriorated. He had only days left to live. Since childhood, he had been under Catherine's control. Weak in character, yet not a fool, he had always tried to break free from his mother's grasp. But in the end, he too became a casualty of her power games. Margot pleaded with her brother to release La Mole. Charles IX whispered to her, "We need him as a scapegoat. Go find your husband, or one day, you'll die at Catherine's hands too." On his deathbed, Charles confessed the truth about the poison. He said, "For the sake of royal dignity, I had to endure the pain of losing my beloved, just as I must now die in silence, witnessing her brother's slow death." Margot grieved for his short, tragic life, and felt helpless for being unable to change her family's fate. Charles IX trusted and depended on Margot deeply. He had once tried to protect her because Henri had saved his life, but even he could not escape his mother's poisonous grip. To secure her power, Catherine plotted to murder Henri, but ended up poisoning her own son instead. Margot knew her mother's cruelty all too well. Facing her brother's death, she was horrified by her mother's ruthlessness, and devastated by the bloodshed within her own family. After Charles IX's death, Catherine's other son ascended the throne as Henri III. La Mole was sentenced to the guillotine. Before his execution, he promised Margot, "If your beloved dies, I will stay by your side forever." It was a vow soaked in fate, both a trap of love and a surrender to death. His longing for Margot became eternal, and in his fear of death, he held onto faith and dignity. He grabbed his friend's hand in terror, but the executioner forced them apart. Though his friend was innocent, he chose to die with La Mole. Both were beheaded together. In the cold morning light, Margot bribed the executioner and walked out holding La Mole's severed head in her arms. She took off her jewelry and gave it to her companion, asking that her belongings be buried with La Mole. This was her most radical act of rebellion, a complete break from her blood-stained family. Margot fled Paris, carrying her lover's head. Rushing toward Henri's refuge in Navarre, the bright red flowers on her white dress looked like shackles she could never remove. They symbolized her resistance against fate's cruelty. and her fearless defiance of executions and bloodshed. Her choice was a silent rebellion against Catherine's brutal rule, and a rejection of her role as a political pawn. The way she cradled his head mirrored La Mole's dying wish. He once said, "If I die, swear to me you'll hold my head sometimes, and kiss me now and then." In that moment, Margot was both a survivor of power and a prisoner of love. Her world had collapsed with La Mole's death. As the carriage rattled down the road, a single tear rolled down her cheek. She had let go completely. In life or death, she had lost the one she loved forever. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.